Hi everyone, Alastair here from Viking, and welcome to another In Conversation. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with a filmmaker and last week with a photographer. So I'm delighted that my guest this week is a painter, or to be more precise, a portrait painter. His brushes and pencils have committed to canvas some of the most well-known faces of our time. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, Margaret Thatcher and the Pope are just some of the eminent personalities who have submitted themselves to his scrutinizing gaze. He is Alexander Talbot-Rice. Alexander, welcome to In Conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Alexander, I was wondering what my first question to you was going to be, and I've come up with this. When you're at a dinner party or in a social situation and people say to you, oh, they ask you, what do you do in life? Do you say, I'm an artist, or do you say, I'm a painter?
I say I'm a portrait painter.
I like that. Yes. Okay. That's good. That's good. And how would you describe your style?
Well, you know, I was trained naturalistically, which when I started out, let's say it was slightly unusual because I left school in 1989, and at that time the predominant style or the predominant art movement was conceptualism. People just weren't interested in looking at anatomy and learning the sorts of techniques that are taught through a process of apprenticeship from a master. And I wanted to understand those sorts of techniques. Initially, it was quite difficult for me to pursue that career, partly because my family had other expectations of what they would consider to be a proper job and what I should do. But eventually I made my way to Florence and then ultimately to Russia, where I was able to study on the masters.
Wonderful. But before we get on to that, let me ask you this. What do you think it is that that motivates people to commission painted portraits of themselves in a world where images have never been so easy to never been simpler to produce, where photography is just omnipresent, and yet still people somehow seem to think that there's something in a painting and a portrait of a painting that will give them something that maybe they won't get from a photograph?
I think both mediums are really important, and it's interesting to see how they've influenced one another. There's no doubt that photography was influenced by portraiture, and now portraiture is influenced by photography. At the same time, I think that there is something that happens when what we see in nature is filtered through the prism of the artist's imagination. When I'm painting a portrait, I'll try to explain what it feels like.
Please do.
I know that the subject, I've only got them for a limited amount of time, and I start off by almost painting the picture with light, just as you do when you're taking a photograph. Mm-hmm. Of course, part of my job as a portrait painter is my ability to bring the best out of the subject, because what I don't want is for them to get bored. In some respects, you're quite lucky, because if you see that moment, you can capture it. And in capturing it, you know, you can get that particular expression that you want, or that moment when the person you're working with isn't feeling self-conscious. But for me, when I look at the person I'm painting, you can imagine my heart is beating, and I'm desperately trying to not just capture the architecture of the person's face, but I'm trying to look at all sorts of things that I can see and feel from that person, whether it's the slight flush of pink in their throat, or the little bit of light that I notice on their lip, or the slight light in their eye, or the particular tilt of their head. So what we're getting in a painting is actually something which is more than just one moment. It's many moments are brought together in one image, and more than that, there's also the interpretation. So I'm not trying to paint photographically. I'm trying to capture atmosphere and expression, and some of that also requires me to exaggerate certain things and perhaps pay less attention to others. So the soul of the painting, the Russians say, is in the eyes and the mouth. So I might be less interested in the shadow in the ear, or the hair, and I might deliberately, even though I can see that those things are darker in nature, I might deliberately make them lighter, so as to create a sort of an inverse perspective, so that the eye, when we're looking at the picture, goes to the soul of the picture, which is in the eyes and the mouth. So there are certain things that we can do as artists which wouldn't be possible in photography, and I think certain things that you can do as a photographer that wouldn't be possible for me as an artist.
Yeah, I work in 250th of a second, whereas you work in days or weeks. Yeah, and I agree with you what you said about the eyes, but they are often said to be the window to the soul, and yet I've been observing people in my supermarket walking around with masks over their faces, and I think I would almost say the mouth is the entrance to the soul, because when you can't see someone's mouth, it's very hard to know what they're thinking. Whereas,
do you know what? It's very interesting you say that, because when Sargent was asked to describe portraiture, his reply was something wrong with the mouth, which coming from Sargent, I thought showed great humility. I think that's a lovely.
That's excellent. Point. And I guess it's an obvious thing to say, but the other thing that I think is really special about painting, and maybe one of the reasons why people want to commission them, is because, for obvious reasons, they are unique. And a photograph is mass-produced, or can be, has the potential to be mass-produced. Although there was one photographer who used to, when he sold his prints, he would take a razor blade and cut through the negative and stick it on the back of the print, so that you were getting a unique print. But nobody really does that anymore. But so that, I think the uniqueness of painting is maybe one of the reasons why people why it's such a something that is really something to be really sought after.
Well, I think another thing is that when I'm painting a picture, when I'm painting at my best, I become a spectator to the painting itself, or the artistic process. So the first part of the painting is always about trying to get everything in the right place. You want to make sure that all the proportions are correct, and that the architecture of the face is right, and so on. But then beyond that, something else comes into the picture. And quite often it feels like you've only seen the picture for the first time, almost at the point when you finished it. And it's also a struggle. It's not easy. I mean, there may be artists that do find painting very easy, but although I've always been quite precocious, when I paint a picture, I'm constantly, painting and then rubbing it off and painting again. And actually, when I'm painting a mouth, for example, I've probably painted that mouth 50 times. And when you see it, you see 3 or 4 brushstrokes. And then you might think, God, he's so, he must be really talented to be able to capture the quality of the mouth in 3 or 4 brushstrokes. But you haven't seen the hundreds of times I've painted it before I understood it so well that I could say it in 3 or 4 brushstrokes. And I think that's where the character comes in. So what we try to do is you want to start off, obviously, by understanding your materials, using the best possible materials, grinding the paint from pigment, using the best possible Belgian linen, priming it the right way, and so forth. Then once you've understood your materials, you need to develop your ability to see, your draftsmanship. And then in a way, when you get middle-aged, as I am now, you get to the point where you can start being looser and you can start saying things more gesturally and with more passion. And that's actually, in a strange way, where it becomes more exciting. And so I've now probably got to a point in my career where I can begin to see an evolution of my own style, which of course would have been completely impossible had I not had the benefit of learning from all the masters that I trained under.
Interesting, wonderful. Yeah. You don't know this, but my father was he was a doctor, and he would have loved myself or my brother to have become, or one of us to have become a doctor. And it was something that neither of us had any interest in doing whatsoever. Now, you come from a military family. Your father was a soldier. Your grandfather was a soldier. Did your parents try and discourage you from picking up paintbrushes and becoming a portrait painter? Or?
I mean, my being an artist wasn't on the screen at all. I think to some extent we're born artists. You know, some people are born with an ability to with mathematical ability, let's say, and other people and naturally talented communicators. And in my case, from ever since I was a tiny little boy, I was painting and drawing, and you see, I was also born in a very I came from a very privileged background. My grandmother was the daughter of Lord Hereford. I spent we used to spend our summer holidays in Herefordshire at her house. My parents lived in a nice house in London. But she died when I was 7 years old. And that's significant because at that time, this was in the 1970s, death duties were 70%. So we had to sell Castleware, a lot of the paintings and other things. My father was also a name at Lloyd's, and it got caught up in that. So I saw at a very early and informative moment in my life the ephemeral nature of money and of property. And but at the same time, I was also then sent to boarding school, a very strict boarding school. So I was 7 years old, and you'll probably remember, and these sorts of schools don't really exist in the same way that they did then. But corporal punishment was one would be beaten for talking after lights out. It was extremely disciplined, quite Spartan lifestyle. One didn't see one's parents for weeks or even months on end. So if you weren't good at sport, I mean, I was fortunate, quite sporty, but if you weren't good at sport, you would have a really, really hard time. The other thing I loved was art, because we had the most wonderful art teacher. Her name was Mrs. Rothery. Mm-hmm. And she was the only female teacher at this little prep school, which was a decade past its best, like most of the teachers at the school. And she looked like a gypsy, or like a cartoon by Toulouse-Lautrec.
Yes.
And she had eyeshadow, and she used to smoke cigars, and she wore her hair up in a bun, and she was quite sort of mysterious. And I used to love going to the art school and working there. It was the one place in this very confined and disciplined school where I could breathe oxygen. And then at the same time, I should explain that I suffered from dyslexia. I was extremely bad at reading and writing.
Yeah.
Now, to me, this was significant because I think that a little adversity at an early age can be a very good thing. And I was told that if I was to succeed, I would have to work twice as hard as anyone else. And I managed to get an art scholarship to get into Stowe. And Stowe School, which is a beautiful private school in Buckinghamshire, in fact, it was the country house of the Duke of Buckingham, gave me a chance. I didn't really have the academic qualifications, but they said, look, let's see how you get on. You've got an art scholarship. You've got a year. See how you do. But if you can't keep up, then you're going to, I'm afraid, have to go somewhere else. I was then very, very lucky, and I had the most wonderful English master, and his name was Jonathan Krieger, and he was the first person that had ever said to me, "Listen, Alex, I don't care how you spell. I want to hear what you have to say."
Wow, that's great. Yeah.
And he showed me that I could actually enjoy English literature and I could enjoy English, and that I wasn't stupid. And I ended up getting an A at A level. I then got a place later to study politics, philosophy, and history at Durham. But when I left school, the expectation was that I would go into the army, like my grandfather, father, and brother, into the Welsh Guards, the family regiment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did something called Brigade Squad, which is it's called an officer type course. It's a pre-RCB, which is what you do before you go to Sandhurst. And I got through Brigade Squad, which was a very, very tough army selection. And then I got into Durham and studied politics, philosophy, and history. But all the time, I was painting. And then while I was at Durham, I sent some of my work to a studio in Italy, and said, "Look, I'm at university. I would dearly love to come and study in Italy." And they offered me a place. And then I said to my father, "Look, I've got the opportunity of studying this incredible studio in Florence. Will you help me?" And he said, "No, you're on your own. Forget about it. Get a proper job." So I said, "Okay, fine, I will." So I left. I got my degree and I went to Florence. Mm. And I started off by sleeping in the Anglican church in Via Maggio. And I said to the priest, "Look, I would like to do a monument to commemorate the men who died liberating Florence from my father's regiment, the Welsh Guards." And the priest said to me, "Well, that would be wonderful." And then I got in touch with the Welsh Guards, and I said, "Look, I've been asked to do a monument to commemorate the men who died liberating Florence. But I said, "But I don't have any money. Would you mind just paying for the marble and I'll carve it?" Now, bear in mind, I've never carved any marble before in my life. I mean, in retrospect, I think it was incredibly arrogant of me to assume that I could carve a marble monument. But, I thought, well, can't be that difficult, So I went to Pietrasanta. I carved this monument. It was, not too bad. And then it was installed by the Bishop of Gibraltar. I got in touch with the British consulate. They reached out to the great and the good in Florence. And amongst those were the Corsini family, who then invited me to be an artist in residence at Palazzo Corsini. So that was kind of where it all started. And,
so you went from making the decision to be a painter and going to Florence to study and sleeping in the church, and 2 months later, you're living with a princess in a palace. Is that right? Have I got that right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
You must
that's
be doing a lot of praying in that church, Alex. Yeah.
I looking back on my life, I think
this was the Palazzo Corsini.
That's right.
I think we have a picture of it. Yeah, we have a picture. How did you love Did you fall in love with Italy and with Florence, and which is one of my favorite cities? The food and the sense of living inside an opera.
You have expressed it so well. I mean, to wake up in the morning, listening to the sound of those bells pealing, to hear the doves cooing, to smell the Tuscan earth, and to eat that delicious food. But then to go to the studio. I remember going into the studio. We had a beautiful oval studio where I worked. And I remember my first model, a lovely girl called Matilda. And I came in a little bit late to the session. And so I got the worst easel spot, which was a picture of her. Well, actually, I ended up, she was standing, and I just basically did a drawing of her bottom and lower back. And but she had the most incredible figure. And I remember just stepping back and thinking, I just hope one day I'm good enough to capture the beauty that I can see. And it was so sublime. You know that just above a girl's bottom, in the lower back, she has these two thumb marks between the spine and the beginning of the bottom.
I think I know that. Yeah.
And you can imagine that it was so beautiful, because I remember this blue shadow, this cold shadow that went into the warm yellow glow of the muscle in her lower back, and then into the beginning of her bottom, and the muscle was flushed pink. And I remember just looking at this and thinking it was perhaps the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. So it's sort of it's this feeling that we have. It's like listening to a tenor singing incredibly beautifully and getting a lump in your throat. Mm-hmm. And it's this feeling I feel when I see something in nature, which I feel like I just have to capture, I have to put down, so that other people can empathize with my feelings.
Oh, you described it beautifully. And I guess, if you had to study painting, Florence is probably, the birthplace of the Renaissance. It's got to be probably the number one choice on the list, I would have thought.
Well, it's very true. It was later, though, whilst I was in Florence, because I was there for some time, I was there for about 3 years, that I heard about this place that had a mythical status amongst artists called the Repin Academy in St. Petersburg. And people, you remember that the Repin Academy, it was only 10 years before that there was the breakup of the Soviet Union, and no one from the West had been able to study at the Repin Academy. It was like being a ballet dancer and having the opportunity to go to the Mariinsky Ballet or the Bolshoi. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, I'm going to go. And so without any introduction, and hardly any money, I flew to Russia, and I went to see the director of the Repin Academy. Now, I have to explain just how arrogant this was. So when you walk into the Repin Academy, the first thing, it's like a cathedral to art. It has 8 different schools, each specializing in a different aspect of art. One school will specialize, for example, in monumental art. Another school will specialize in icons. Another one in for example, Russian Impressionism. And each master there has been there his whole life. And these guys are extraordinarily good. So the students that go to the Repin Academy are drawn from the whole of Russia. And, Russia is a country with 7 different time zones. And the way it's organized is that students, they try to identify people of exceptional talent and develop that talent at an early age. So the students that go to the Repin Academy, they come in through this very low door. You almost have to duck in to get underneath it. And then you find yourself in this extraordinary rotunda. And the first thing they do once you register is they tell you to do a drawing of the architecture of this rotunda with all the steps and the columns and so forth. And it's extremely difficult to do a drawing. And it's, if they're not good enough, they just do another one and another one, another one. Some students have been there for a year or more, just doing a drawing. And only when a drawing is good enough are they allowed actually to get in to the Repin Academy. So this Englishman turned up, didn't speak any Russian, said to the rector's secretary, I would like to meet the rector. I've come from England to meet him. she misunderstood and assumed that I had an appointment, which I didn't. So I went to meet the rector, and he was a very tall man with a very, very deep Russian baritone voice, and he smoked a Russian cigarette, one of those ones with a pinched filter between his teeth.
Yeah,
and he took it out, and he looked very, very Soviet. His hair was cut very, very short, and it was grey, and he looked very imposing. And he looked at me, and he said, "Well, can I see your work?" So I showed him my work, and I said, "Look, I've been studying in Italy, and I've been working as an assistant at the Florence Academy. I really want to study here." So he sat back and he said, "And which of the masters would you like to study with?" And I said, "Could I see their work, please?"
Boy, and he still let you in.
Yeah. And in fact, I studied in Repin's old studio with a great artist who sadly has died now, called Pimenov, and then latterly also with an artist called Devertov. And Devertov has an interesting story. He had been he was in the restoration department of the Repin Academy, and he was involved with restoring one of the paintings by Rembrandt at the Hermitage. And it was a great honor to work with him and really understand these techniques that were used by the old masters.
But presumably at this time, Alex, you didn't have a lot of money. You must have life was it tough? What was your living conditions for you?
It was very tough because there were bread queues at that time, and I used to buy myself one chicken a week, and I would have one meal a day, a dinner, and I would also have some borscht at the academy. Which you could get. But when I arrived at the academy, my master, Pimenov, was very tough on me because he wanted to get the best out of me. So when I arrived, I used to get there. I would walk through the snow because it was quite a long walk from where I lived to get to the academy. We would get there at 8 o'clock. We'd work from 8 o'clock solidly until 3:15. And I was allowed 15 minutes off from 3:15 to 3:30 to have something to eat, some borscht. And then I would work from 3:30 till 5, and then from 5 till 8 I'd be studying Russian every day except Sunday.
Wow!
So it was really tough. And in the morning I would have to do 25 sketches because Pimenov felt that I was too tight, too academic, having come from Florence. So he wanted to loosen me up, and so I would have to do 25 sketches every morning. And then in the afternoons, I would be doing a longer, drawing or painting. And the result of that is that now when I see somebody, I don't have to think about how I draw. It's almost
instinctive.
It's like sitting someone in. How can I describe? So it's. Sometimes in England they would say to you, express yourself. I remember when I was at school, the art teacher would always say, express yourself. But that's like sitting someone in front of a piano and telling them to express themselves if they've never learned to play the piano. You just make a horrible noise. And it's the same thing with painting. First of all, you have to learn how to draw what you can see. This is your vocabulary. And then once you've got that vocabulary, then you can express yourself because you don't have to think about it. You can paint and draw from the heart.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, can we move on, Alex, to talking about some of the illustrious people that you've painted in your career as a portrait painter? In 2004, having trained at Florence and in St. Petersburg, in 2004, you do your first royal portrait of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, what I'm really curious to know, and these may sound to you silly questions, but I'm just curious to know, I mean, what's the process here? Does the Duke of Edinburgh wake up one morning and think, about time I got another self-portrait, portrait painted, I've got to call my buddy Alex? And I mean, how does it work? Who contacts you?
Okay, so what happened was I came back from the Ripon Academy in around about 2002. In 2003, I painted a portrait of Bishop Richard Charteris, who was the Bishop of London. And he was also the Anglican representative to the Russian Orthodox Church. So I painted a picture of him, and that was an interesting, just very quick aside. I wasn't happy with my painting. And then at our last sitting, I said, look, sir, I think I could, if I do this again, I know I could do a better job. And he smiled and he said, well, look, Alex, I think that's very honest. If you're willing to paint it, I'm willing to sit for it. So I destroyed the first one, did it again, and it was one of the best things I'd ever done. And he, unbeknown to me, was a trustee at Windsor Castle. And they'd been looking for several years for someone to paint the Duke of Edinburgh in Garter uniform. And he basically said to the Duke of Edinburgh, look, there's this young artist, he's just done a painting of me, have a look at this, what do you think? And I was chosen to do the portrait of His Royal Highness.
So I love there's a narrative emerging here of how it seems to me in your life, Alex, that one painting takes you to the next one, or the sculpture in the church in Florence takes you to the princess's palace, and which takes you on, and then Russia, and then so you have to paint the Duke of Edinburgh, and so does somebody does a big black car come and pick you up, or do you actually drive into Buckingham Palace?
Okay, so no, I literally the police, of course, were given my number plate and everything, and I drove my little Mini Cooper through the front gates of Buckingham Palace with a policeman saluting smartly, and I drove up in front of the palace, and I took out all of my paraphernalia for the painting, and I was met at a side entrance by a footman who took me down long corridors and steep staircases, past paintings by great masters like Sir Joshua Reynolds and Gainsborough and so on. And I'm thinking to myself, no pressure, no pressure, And then I went down the corridor to the yellow drawing room, which is the room adjacent to the balcony overlooking the Mall from which the royal family greet the nation. Wow. And the footman said to me, would you like some tea, sir? And I went, oh yes, please. Now, I got there very early because I was terrified of being late. As you know, the Duke of Edinburgh doesn't suffer fools gladly, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't late. So I was drinking tea. That and the nerves, I found I was dying to go for a pee. So I thought, well, I'll chance my luck. So I went out of the door, turned left. Thank God I found a loo, used it, got back as quickly as I could, just before the Duke of Edinburgh strode into the room with his private secretary. And I stood to attention and bowed my head and said, how do you, Royal Highness? And, how do you do? Shook my hand and said, do take your jacket off. So I took my jacket off. And he took my flies were gaping open.
Oh my God, oh my God.
And he burst out laughing and said, you should get yourself a zipper. And that kind of broke the ice. And after that, we were fine.
Yeah, I mean, he's supposed to have a pretty good sense of humor, isn't he? I think he would.
He was so kind to me. Right. I can't tell you. I mean, after I did that painting, he then invited me down to Windsor Castle for the weekend, and I did a picture for his own collection of him driving his carriage and four in hand.
Oh,
and that was when I first met the Queen. So I was very fortunate to have met the Queen before I was later asked to paint her portrait.
So when Alex, when you're painting someone's, I mean, is it decided beforehand? Is there somebody come and say to you, okay, Alex, you've got an hour, 2 hours, 3 days, whatever? I mean, how long do you get? And is that decided beforehand?
Yes, I mean, as an artist, I'll usually say, well, what I need for this painting is that the sittings must take place in the same location, because I need constant light source. And I need at least 3 hours with the subject over 3 months. So, for example, when the Queen was sitting for me at Buckingham Palace, I was with her for an hour at a time. And but then there would be quite a long gap in between where I could develop and work on the painting before our next sitting. And then hopefully by the last sitting, it's pretty much finished. And then that gives the subject the opportunity to make any remarks. So if, for example, they weren't quite sure about something, then I would have the opportunity of being able to alter it before it was seen by anyone.
Well, we've got on Alex on the screen now. We have the portrait that you painted of the Queen in her carriage, and what's actually happening in this painting? There's a story going on here.
So yeah, it was commissioned by the Worshipful Company of Ironmongers, which is a city livery company, one of the oldest. And the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Michael Oliver, who you can see in the bottom left-hand side of the painting, had the honour of presenting the Pearl Sword to Elizabeth I on the occasion of her Golden Jubilee. So this was commissioned to commemorate the Golden Jubilee, and she's sitting in the coronation coach, which she's only been in about 3 times in her life. And interestingly, the sword was given to the City of London by Elizabeth I. So when the Queen enters the city, the mayor, the Lord Mayor, presents the hilt of the sword to the Queen as an act of fidelity, and so that's what this is commemorating. And he told me a funny story about that. Before the occasion, he woke up in the middle of the night, and because he'd had a dream that he dropped the sword, and he saw all the pearls bouncing down the stairs, and was, so he got up in his pajamas and was practicing holding this thing and how he was going to show it to the Queen. And his wife woke up and saw him with the sword, doing this, thought he had gone completely mad. So it's, one of the best parts of my job is that, and by the way, of course, I also have to be incredibly discreet. So I'm afraid I can't tell you about my sitting with the Queen, but
go on, Alex, go on.
but one of the best parts of my job is it does take me to these sorts of extremes. So from the drawing rooms of royalty to for example, the earth floors of tribal elders in the Hindu Kush. From poverty, where I really understood what it was like to be hungry, and like to be frightened of being in debt and not having a home, or to moments where I've been with world leaders and where I've been extremely fortunate in selling paintings very well.
Mm-hmm. You've nicely teed up my next question, which was in 2009, you take yourself off to Afghanistan, and you, for reasons you'll explain to us, you decide to travel on horseback over the Hindu Kush, which is, if anybody doesn't know, it is a pretty cold and barren mountain range running to the length of Afghanistan. And this we have on the screen right now. Now, the image on the screen right now, I originally thought it was a painting. It has a really painterly quality to it. And as only when I look closer, I realize it's a photo. I'm right, am I?
That's absolutely right. Yes.
Yes. It's a beautiful. It's a beautiful image. So just tell us what happened to get you on a horse in the Hindu Kush?
Well, it was a very human situation. I married. I married in haste, let's say, and my wife and I sadly found out that we didn't know one another as well as we thought, and we didn't have the same expectations. And I can honestly say that it was the most difficult time of my life. I've never felt more lonely than when I was in that situation. I remember laying in bed at night thinking to myself, how the hell do I get out of this? I knew that I'd made a mistake. What made it all the more difficult was that we had a lovely little baby girl, and I didn't know what the right thing to do was. But I did know that I had to be true to myself. And I wanted to be a good father to my daughter, and I wanted her to know me, and I wanted her to grow up in a happy environment. So my wife and I separated, and I actually spoke to the Prince of Wales, who I was painting at that time, and he said to me, well, I'm the patron of a charity in Afghanistan called Turquoise Mountain Foundation. And one of the things we're trying to do, the aegis of, or the objectives of the charity were to rebuild the old town in Kabul using traditional Afghan building methods. And what they then wanted to do was to hand it back, if you like, to the Afghan people. But they also wanted it to be self-sustaining. So they wanted to, for example, understand something of the Afghan artistic legacy. They wanted to develop ceramics and calligraphy and these sorts of things within the context of an Islamic artistic tradition. So he said, look, Rory Stewart, who's doing this, who's done a great job, but he doesn't know anything about art, and maybe you'd like to see if you can help. So I said, well, of course I'd love to, and it was, for me, it was an opportunity to do something that I felt was important, and ironically, by taking myself to the war zone, I found peace and perspective on my own problems. Because of course, all the people that were in Afghanistan had really suffered. And by contrast, my worries, which were financial, a sense of guilt and failure and so forth, paled by comparison. And in actual fact, we were able to work pretty effectively. So after about 2 months, we had got that on track. And I then decided that I wanted to see more of the country. So I bought 3 horses, and with an Afghan Hazara horseman and another friend of mine, we rode 500 miles across Afghanistan from Banyan, where the Buddhists were blown up by the Taliban, to Mazar-e-Sharif.
Sorry, Alex, who are the people in the photo we're looking at now?
Okay, so I'm on the far left.
Yeah.
Next to me is Zabi Abdullah Majidi, who's half German, half Afghan, and basically was my translator. And then next to him is Jamaluddin, who was a Hazara horseman, Bushkashi rider, who looked like a pirate.
Yeah.
And then the one on the far right was someone else that Zabi knew. And that photograph was taken in a place called Shokhta Chinar, which it translates to City of Screams. And it's colorfully named after the time that Genghis Khan went there and basically decimated it. It was an extraordinary journey, really. It was a great privilege to go there, and I don't say that lightly. I mean it. There were places like that were extremely cold and rather inhospitable, but there were other places that were like heaven on earth, where the sky was so blue because we were at high altitude. We were at 14,000 feet above sea level. So there was a beautiful, deep blue sky. And then beneath you, you would see this glacial water running through the valley like milk. And grass that was so green, it almost defined the color green. It was a sort of it was a what's the right word? High definition reality. It was like looking at a high definition television.
Yeah.
And all sorts of things happened. I mean, we went to one village where I was drugged by bandits that presumably wanted to kidnap me. And I realized I'd been drugged, and I woke the others up, and Jamal ad-Din basically chucked me on a horse and grabbed the reins, and we rode off into the night for about 10 hours until we came to the next village. I was barely conscious. The next day, we came to a village where the people were so sweet, and they gave me dates and basically nursed me back to health. It was an extraordinary land, almost like a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, where you have heaven and hell next to one another. And for me,
yes, Dante's yes, circles of.
It really was. And the funny thing is that I think because of the nature of my life, I found it easier to connect with the people there than others might, because we're living in a sort of in Afghanistan, it's a pre-industrial world. And so one of the things I did while I was there is I set up my own charity called the Afghan Rugby Federation. Because you see, sport had been banned by the Taliban. And I thought that rugby was the kind of game that might appeal to the Afghans. And I thought it would be a good way of connecting with people. So I put this together with an Afghan. And then we fielded a match at ISAF HQ in Kabul, and against the British Army. And the Afghan team won. It was a sevens rugby match. And this was the talk of the local bazaar. And the team that we'd fielded was made up of Tajik, Hazara, Pashtu, lots of different tribes brought together through sport. And it's still going strong, the Afghan Rugby Federation, which is now entirely Afghan run. So that was quite fun. And then later I went down to Helmand province and was with the British Army.
But were you on the first trip, when you were in the Hindu Kush, were you painting and sketching on that
Yes.
trip?
Yes,
you were,
absolutely. Yeah.
Because it's so wonderful in a way, but what you do is such a, it goes beyond language in a way, and you can, if you can paint someone or draw someone, you have a communication immediately, even if you don't show each other.
You're so right, and one thing I've learned from all of my travels and experiences is that actually, what defines us isn't whether or not we're Muslim or Christian, or whether we're British or Afghan or Russian. It's whether or not we are intelligent or kind, brave, adventurous, and it's those qualities that define us and unite us. And when I go to Afghanistan, or if I'm in Russia, I find that when I meet like-minded people, one instantly recognizes one another, and all these other things have become really unimportant. We're much more united in terms of our common humanity, and I think one of the wonderful things about all forms of art, photography and painting, is it brings us together in our common humanity.
That's a lovely thing to say. I quite agree, absolutely. But so 3 years after your first trip to Afghanistan, you went back, but this time as a war artist. Am I right? Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
And so Alex, well, maybe just because I think a lot of people, I remember I was surprised to realize a long time ago, but I realized that there is such a thing as a war artist, that there's still a desire to have proper paintings of men at war. And so how does that work? What's the process there?
It was made possible because of my brother. At that time, he was a brigadier. He recently retired as a major general. Now, you must remember in 2012, the Welsh Guards were out in Afghanistan, and I think it was about their third tour in Afghanistan. And they'd had a very tough time in Afghanistan. A lot of Welsh Guardsmen had died. And I think there was a part of me that felt quite guilty. In a sense, I was supposed to be a soldier, and there were the boys from my family regiment getting killed, and here I was in safety. And perhaps I had skills that, could help save lives. I understood the particular dynamics that exist on the ground in Afghanistan. I know how to talk to the Afghan people and to connect with them. So I went through what's called HEAT, which is basically a course that you do if you're going into a war zone. And then it was rather exciting. I went to Brize Norton and was flown into Camp Bastion, from there to Lashnagar. And from Lashnagar, I went to forward operating bases, and I was with the Welsh Guards and the Yorks, literally on the front line. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And what did the soldiers make of you? I mean, did they think, oh, why have we got this artist fellow with us? We got to protect. Or
you have to remember that way back when I'd done brigade squad, so I'd done all the things that they'd done.
Of course, yeah.
I didn't carry a gun. I carried a camera and a sketch pad and a pencil.
Yeah.
And it was quite fun, actually. I also had a suit. So we used to drive in armored vehicle to see, for example, the governor of Helmand province, or the commander of the Afghan army, or whoever it was. And when we got there, I would strip down and change into my suit, and then go to see them wearing a suit in the middle of the desert. And they looked at me as if I was some sort of apparition. And I would sit down and have tea with them and chat to them. And then I did a drawing, you see. And what I did was I drew all of the main players. I drew Governor Gulab Mangal. I drew General Wahidi, the commander of the Afghan army. I drew General Sharon Shah. I drew all of the main actors, if you like, on the scene. And then I organised an exhibition at Lashnagar, and General Guarenas, who was commanding US forces at that time, had been trying for ages to get all of these people in the same place at the same time, and hadn't been able to. But they all came to Lashnagar to see their portraits.
Yeah.
So ironically, through art, we were able to get all of these people around the table at the same time with General Guarenas. And I think it appealed to the Americans. They thought only the Brits would come up with an idea like this.
Yeah, that's left field thinking. That's great. So let's go. I mean, I could just talk about this for like 3 hours, but we've got more subjects to cover. In 2010. We're going forward a bit here. You were commissioned to produce a portrait of Lady Margaret Thatcher. So once again, I mean, I have sort of pretty much similar questions that I asked you about the Duke of Edinburgh. I mean, how was that a painting that led to that? How did that come about? And where did you paint her?
Well, I had an exhibition in Washington at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. I was part of something called the Great Britain's Exhibition. And it coincided with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh's visit to the National Portrait Gallery. So I met the director of the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. And I said to him, well, I would really love to paint Lady Thatcher. Could we please do this to commemorate the Anglo-American relationship? And he said, well, that would be fantastic if you could do that, Alex. So I actually, I got in touch with her through an intermediary, and a letter had been written by the director of the Smithsonian Institute requesting that Margaret sit for me, and she very kindly agreed. And so I went to her house in Chester Square, and I met her. And I must say, I've met some extraordinary people in my life, but without doubt, she is the most extraordinary human being I've ever met.
Oh, really? Why?
Well, other people have talked about her magnetism, And it was only when you actually met her that you got that. I mean, whatever you think of her politics, she had something very, very special. And of course, you and I grew up remembering what she was like when she was Prime Minister.
I remember.
So one of the things I noticed about her first is that the way that she spoke was very deliberate, and her timing was very deliberate. So that when she was speaking to you, it was almost as if she could control time. Usually when we're speaking to one another, there's a certain sort of rhythm, isn't there, to conversation. But I remember her shaking my hand and looking at me directly and saying, "How do you do? Do sit down." And there was something about the deliberate quality, the way that, and while she was saying it, and you couldn't see anything else. I literally saw in her so much inner strength. It was absolutely fascinating.
That is fascinating. Yeah, you remind me of the quote of was it I think the French President Mitterrand, who said about Margaret Thatcher that she had the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe, I think.
There's something very attractive about her, about being in the presence of something very special. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you must remember that when I was painting her, this was the last painting that was ever done of her. She was very elderly, quite frail. And there was also, I think, in that painting, you also see a softness and a vulnerability, which is also interesting, I think. So it was a combination of the two. On the one hand, the inner spirit, the light was still burning, and yet at the same time, there was this frailty and vulnerability, which I must say made the painting very, very significant to me.
Just tell me, I'm curious to know, when you're painting someone like Margaret Thatcher or the Duke of Edinburgh or the Queen, I mean, is there much conversation going on? I mean, you just, is it just all done in silence?
No. I talk all the time when I'm painting, and I tell funny stories and I make them laugh and so on, just to so that I can see how they help them to relax as well, because it doesn't matter if you're the Queen or the Duke of Edinburgh. You're of course going to feel quite shy, because when an artist is looking at you, especially, I think maybe when I'm painting, I do look at people very directly, and that can be unnerving, and I'm aware of that. So I want to try to soften it by telling them funny stories, and usually at my own expense, and help them to relax. And then while they're relaxing, I can try to capture their humanity, because whoever we are, we're all of us vulnerable, and I think it's that I think the wonderful thing about what we do, what you do and what I do, is that it involves empathy, and it's not for us to judge, actually. And it's a fine line, because whilst we're working, we have to sort of stand astride the conscious and the subconscious, don't we? And so that's sort of what's happening through the process. I think a lot of what I do and what you do is it's intuitive, and you feel it. And you can teach someone how to draw, but you can't teach them how to love what they see.
Yeah, no, you put it beautifully. I quite agree. There's talking of famous faces, Alex. You after Margaret Thatcher, you painted Pope Benedict XVI, and yes. Was that in the Vatican that you did that?
Yes.
Or? Yeah. Yes. And so I'm just guessing he he saw the painting of Margaret Thatcher? I mean, did the Vatican ring you up and say, come and do the photograph, come and paint the Pope, or
I was given the opportunity of painting him. The rather frustrating thing about that painting is that I just finished it when he decided to resign. Which, he is, of course, he is still alive. And it was interesting. In his case, he's an extremely cerebral man. Mm-hmm. And that's when I was quite glad that I had gone to Durham University and studied politics, philosophy, and history, because we ended up talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine of Hippo. And so you know, he was quite. I found him to be quite shy, and but when he was talking about theology, a light came up in his eye, and he said, "Oh, but you know," and that was sort of what I was trying to capture in that picture.
And when you're with the Pope or some of these other personalities, I mean, is there security there? Are other people in the room, and or are you just left alone?
Well, actually, I'll tell you one little story about my painting of the Queen. When I was painting the Queen, you remember that she's sitting in the coronation coach, and she actually sat for me in the Royal Mews. And I remember we were introduced. Don't forget, I spent the weekend, you know, with her and the Duke of Edinburgh, and we'd had dinner together and breakfast and things like that. So she knew who I was, but we were formally introduced by I don't think I can say who, but someone, you know, quite important at the palace. And said, "Your Majesty, this is the artist who will be painting your portrait." And of course, you know, I did what you always do when you meet the Queen, which is, you know, bow your head and say, "Hi to Your Majesty." And she went, "How do you do?" And looked at me, and her eyes sparkled as they do, and it was like the sun coming out. And then we walked into the Mews, and you know, I explained to her the pose, and she's perfectly at home, of course, in the Royal Mews. You know, it's probably somewhere she can absolutely relax. You know, so she was sitting in the coronation coach, and this chap was standing behind me. Now you can imagine at that time I was still very young and inexperienced, and this fellow was standing behind me in the middle of you know, I'm trying to paint the most important commission of my life, and this fellow's standing behind me. And so I said to him, "Listen, will you forgive me? I'm afraid I'm sure you can understand. I have to focus on Her Majesty 100%. If you wouldn't mind waiting outside, I'll let you know if I need anything." Well, he looked a little, you know, put out, but the Queen didn't say anything, so he walked out and went outside. And about halfway through the painting, he came back in again, and the Queen looked up and said, "What are you doing in here? Is it cold outside?" And at that point, I thought, "Man, you're just the best." I love you. Yeah. She was very protective of me and very, very kind. But yes, sometimes you do get people that surround people that are very important, who are, for want of a better word, crashing snobs. You find that the principals, the people themselves, are very natural and kind and unstuffy. And so I always try to get the balance right between never forgetting who I'm painting, but at the same time not being obsequious. And that seems to work quite well.
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? I mean, it must be. I bet you come out of those sittings feeling exhausted. I mean, you're looking. You mentioned the consciousness and the conscious and the subconscious. There's all the other people around. The situation that's new to you. It's a lot to handle. Yeah. Alex,
but you know, it's the adrenaline, I think, brings the best out in us.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Talking of adrenaline, Alex, we've got questions are pouring in here, and I'm going to hit you with some of them. If that's
great.
All right.
Ask me anything.
Okay, one from Janet Harrelson in San Diego. Hello, Janet. She says, "Do you ever paint from a photograph, or is it always live sittings?"
Janet, I do paint from photographs, because you can imagine I've only got a limited amount of time with the subject, and there's so much information I want to capture. So usually, at our first sitting, I take photographs and then I show those to the subject. And that's very useful, because it gives them also, it has the advantage of giving the subject a sense of where I'm going with the composition. So they have an idea of what I'm trying to capture right from the outset. Then at our second sitting, which is perhaps a month later, they can see the painting, and I turn the painting so that it's facing them. So they can actually see what I'm doing whilst I'm painting it, which makes the sitting much more fun for them. And if, for example, I'm trying to capture some light in their eye or whatever it is, then they of course get that, and they can see it, and they can see how the paintings. So it's almost as if we're both participating, we're both painting the picture together, which is very exciting.
That's the secret. Yeah,
and then,
that's great.
Sometimes also I'll, for example, in the painting of the Queen, I would be going back to Buckingham Palace every day in between painting the coronation coach and the other things that I could do while she wasn't there.
Right. Okay. That's nicely answered. Here's a good question. I was going to ask you myself, but I'm going to let Fred Mermelstein ask it. Fred says, what would you do if your subject absolutely hated your portrait of them?
Well, Fred, I think I partly answered that with the last question. So what I do is I try to protect myself by letting the subject see where I'm going. So there's never really a moment of surprise. It's not as if, suddenly, if I'm doing your painting, Fred, you're going to go, oh God, I had no idea you were going to paint me like that. So it's a process, and right. I make sure that right from the outset we're both on the same page, and hopefully there won't be any surprises.
Okay. Holger Steinman in Boston says, did you know from a young age you had this skill and desire to paint? Well, I think that's obvious. How would you recommend a young person today to develop their artistic skills? Travel seems to have been a core part of developing yours.
That's a very, very good question. I would say that the most important aspect of painting is draftsmanship. So if you're a young person, before you start making it too difficult for yourself by working with oil paint or with watercolor, which are both very difficult mediums, start by having the patience and humility to learn how to draw just with graphite pencil on paper, and maybe even copy some old masters, because you can learn so much by doing that. And then if you understand light and shadow, then you've got the architecture, if you like, for painting. And then once you've got that, then the painting will be much, much easier.
Beautiful. Mary Jones in Eugene says, are there any particular types of people who are easier to capture? Are outgoing people easier to capture than shy people, for example?
I like painting people that have lots of character. So it's much better for me as an artist to paint an old man with huge ears and a character, lots of character lines, for example. That's much easier for me than painting a child, for example, that hasn't had the same sorts of life experiences. And also, one of the things one has to be a little bit careful of, and I'm saying this for other artists, is not to remember that a painting isn't a photograph. You don't want that Kodak moment. We're so used to having photos that we take of big smiles, and actually an animated smile doesn't always work in a painting. So a painting needs to be more psychological, more reflective. So yeah, that's my...
Thank you, Alex. Tony Hackenberg in the Villages, Florida asks, did your first sketch, he's been paying attention, huh? Did your first sketch of the rotunda at the St. Petersburg Art Academy pass muster? If not, how many takes did it take?
I was allowed to skip that, thank God. I got straight in. I went straight through the door.
I'm so disappointed.
But Pimenov, who is my master, Repin, sat behind me for 6 weeks before he bothered saying anything to me at all. And eventually he was so frustrated with the way I was painting, because I was desperately trying to understand the Russian technique, which is completely different from the Italian academic or French academic technique, that he snatched the brush out of my hand and said, "Нет, это плохо," which means no, this is terrible, and then started painting on my picture. And to start off with, I thought, oh, poor old boy, he was obviously good once, but you know, and then I looked at it and I thought, hang on a minute, that looks rather good. And then I realized that he was just painting in a totally different way, and I had to think completely differently. So I was very, very lucky in working for the master. And actually, when I left the Repin Academy, he chose me out of all of his students to do a painting of the prima ballerina at that time. So I ended up being his favorite student.
You won him over. Excellent.
Oh, and now I'm an honorary professor at the Repin Academy.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, they made me a professor, so that's the ultimate.
Now you can go and snatch the brush out of other students and go, "Niet."
Niet, это плохо. No, I wouldn't do that. I would say though that I could not be the artist that I am were it not for the education I got in Russia. I genuinely owe Russia my career, because they saw the talent in me, fostered that talent. And even now, it's interesting how my career has gone full circle, and I'm now living and working and painting in Russia, because you know, this is where I'm finding inspiration. And there's the reason for that. And I promise to answer more questions, but the reason for that is that if we think of Paris in the 19th century, and you think of Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec and Monet and all of this exciting time in Montmartre and so on, this is what, in a sense, Russia is like now, because there's still a bohemian life. If you go to Montmartre today, I love Paris, I love the French, they love art, but those studios in Montmartre are lived in by bankers. Artists couldn't afford to live there. No. If you're in St. Petersburg, you can still drink the wine of inspiration from the ballet, from, you know, talking to poets and writers and so on. It's a very inspiring place to be.
Wonderful, wonderful. Amalia Hodge in San Francisco says, "Thank you for a fascinating insight into your life. Who in the world would you wish to paint next?"
What a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I love painting world leaders, and I think I should paint the next president of the United States, whoever that is.
Whoever that is, yeah. Well, you probably will. Al Hepner in Pleasanton, California, I think it's California, says, "Other than the Bishop of London, have you destroyed any other paintings, and who and why?"
Yes, but you don't normally see them. I mean, this was the only occasion I actually showed it to the principal, and I said, "Listen, I'm not happy with this."
Okay. All right.
I quite often do things and I say, it's not good enough, it's not as good as it could be, and then I start again from scratch. And I think you have to have that. And I think that goes back to my childhood when I was dyslexic and I was struggling to read and write, and I was told I had to work twice as hard if I wanted to achieve anything. You always have to be tough on yourself and not you know. I'm sure, Alastair, you find the same thing when you're working. Sometimes you just, this isn't good enough. I can do better than this. I can push myself further.
90% of the time, I think. But, here's another question. Well, it's not a question, it's just a compliment. Katie O'Brien in Parkland says, "Thank you for being so honest with all of your portraits and personalities. What a wonderful inside look to these famous icons. So tasteful."
Thank you.
Lene in Oslo says, "Thank you for a fantastic conversation. I have a question. Do you paint what you see or what you feel, or what they want you to see or feel?" That's a good question. Yeah, how much are you trying to...
Very good. How much? I believe I paint what I feel. I think that the start of the picture is very much about understanding the, for example, just simple geometric shapes, the light, shadow, this kind of thing. But how you execute what you see and what you paint, it definitely comes so much from the heart. And this is as I said before, this is something that you can't teach. This love of what you see, and sometimes the playfulness of it. One thing I would say in terms of a criticism, which I might give to young artists, is I would say a painting should be very much like music. There should be some parts of a painting which are gentle, and other parts which are said with confidence. And you, it's this atmosphere between what you see and how you execute it that comes from inside.
Thank you. Here's a good question. Anne Marie Blom from Palm Springs says, what is your connection to Viking? Do you give talks on Viking ships? Thank you for such interesting stories. So maybe you should mention Xander at this point.
Exactly. So I was introduced through a great friend of mine called Xander Parrish, who's the principal dancer at the Mariinsky Ballet. And he's one of the nicest people I know. I have had the privilege of painting him. This is an example of one of my pictures.
It's wonderful.
He is such a nice man, and it's quite interesting. We found that we both had almost parallel careers. He had found inspiration in Russia by being one of the first British dancers to study at the Mariinsky Ballet, and now I think he is the first principal dancer at the Mariinsky. So he's now world famous, and it's really lovely that he's a great ballet dancer. I'm an accomplished artist, and we can work together. And I think that it's this kind of cross-pollination which is very strong between what we do. Viking is an extraordinary organization because it enables people to experience adventure. It enables people to go to a place like Russia and have a unique insight into the culture and sensibility of that country. Really, that's what we're all talking about. Life is very short. It should be an adventure. It should be exciting. And so I think it's a great fit for me to be able to participate, if you like, with Viking. And if I were able to go on a cruise and talk, I would be honored.
I think we'd be honored, Alex, and it's lovely that you have that connection with Xander because he's a very good friend of Viking. So that's lovely. A very nice couple of questions. Same question from two people here, and Alice Landor and Joanne Judges. Sorry, Joanne, if I pronounced that wrong. They both ask, has your daughter followed in your footsteps?
Yes, she has.
There we go. Oh, nice.
She's not an artist, but yet, because she's still very young. She's 14, so she might decide to do all sorts of things. But she's definitely got artistic talent. And I was just talking to her last night. I don't see as much of her as I'd like, and I have to travel a lot. She lives in Edinburgh with her mother, but I'm very proud of her, and I love her very much, and I always enjoy seeing her.
Oh, that's lovely. That's great. There's maybe some work for you here, Alex. Alice Landor in Heidelberg says, since you can paint from a photo, do you take commissions from the States, and how can we find out more?
Well, I would be very, very happy to hear from you, and you can contact me.
Through your website, maybe?
Through my website, yeah. My email should be there. It's alex@alextalbotrice.com. And maybe we can discuss, what you need, what you require. But I'm always happy to do paintings for anybody, not just because it's how I make money, but because it's fun and exciting. So what really interests me is the project itself, and trying to do things in a slightly original way.
Right. Lovely. Alex, I'm going to let you go. We've talked for, well, I could talk for much longer, but thank you so much for being so honest and literally painting lovely pictures with your words. Thank you very much. It's been a real
Alastair,
pleasure.
it's been such an honor for me to be, involved in this conversation. I have so much respect for you and your work, and you've made what might have otherwise been quite a frightening experience of being on the other side of the canvas a real pleasure.
Oh, well, that's lovely. Well, thank you so much, Alex. And I hope, one day maybe see you on a ship.
Definitely.
Somewhere
I would love
when
that.
we get back to sailing again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. So it just remains for me to say a couple of things. Firstly, if I didn't answer or ask all the questions that were sent in, my apologies. But I think time was against us. And I remember, or those of you watching last week may remember that I set you a photo challenge. The subject I chose was looking out, looking in. Looking out because we're starting maybe now to, in a little way, starting to look out a little bit more from the confinement that we were living in for the last 3 months, and looking in because maybe also we've been using this time to reflect on ourselves. So you could take it in that way, or just in a more prosaic way, or looking out at whatever you're looking out on, and maybe looking back in at the same time. So please feel free to send in your photos. We've had some in already, and the address I think is going to be, yep, there it is on the screen below me. Send in your images, and we'll find a place on the platform, on the Viking.TV platform, to exhibit them. So thank you all for watching. It just remains for me to wish you all well and to invite you to join us for another conversation next week. Thank you and goodbye.